Hi there, Steve here. Today I want to talk about Japanese. And I'm thinking of doing a series on different languages, which I would call Steve's Easy Introduction to. And this one is Steve's Easy Introduction to Japanese. I think we get a lot of very many people have sort of an anxiety attack when they approach a new language, especially if they open a book and it's full of detailed explanation about the pronunciation. And in the case of Japanese, they talk about pitch, which I've never understood. And people get hung up about those things that are different in Japanese. So let me just give you an easy introduction to Japanese. Japanese is not obviously a language related to English. So it's going to take you longer to get used to the structure of Japanese than, say, a language like French. You are going to encounter immediately the difficulty that a lot of words seem to sound the same because Japanese, in fact, has fewer sounds than English. But it's one of these things that you just get used to. So if we start with verbs, and I like to approach languages in terms of verbs, nouns, adjectives, adverbs, pronouns, cause, and purpose. Maybe a few other things. If you get a sense of those things, the rest of the language is going to fall into place. Now, a problem with Japanese is the writing system because you have to learn three of them: katakana, hiragana, and the Chinese characters, the kanji. I recommend you start with hiragana. Don't spend too much time on katakana, which is parallel to the hiragana, but do make an effort to learn the kanji, the Chinese characters, if you intend to stay with your Japanese in order to achieve a high level of proficiency. Because once you have the Chinese characters, you can read. You can read newspapers, magazines, books, and so forth. Now, verbs. In Japanese, very simply put, there's a few things you have to be aware of. One, there's a simple form and a not so simple form of every verb. That's before we get into the issue of politeness, okay? So, ikimasu is to go. It can be I go, you go, he go, they go, ikimasu. So, an advantage in Japanese is you don't have to worry about all the different changes in verbs that happen in, say, French. Ikimasu. And there's a shorter form which is iku. Ikimasu, iku, the same. Go. Taberu, tabemasu. Eat. I'm not going to go through them all because if you don't know Japanese, it's just so much noise. Just be aware that there's a simple and a longer form, and you can kind of use them interchangeably, and you needn't worry about when one word is used or another word is used, because until you have enough exposure to the language, you won't get it right. And once you have enough exposure, you'll naturally start to use it right. And in the end, it probably doesn't matter. You can use them interchangeably, regardless of what people say. Now, to express the past tense, iku now becomes, or ikimasu, go, I go, you go. Ikimasu becomes ikimashita. Mashita is the past tense. Taberu, tabemasu, tabemashita. Now we're in the past tense. Now, again, there's a simple form of that. Instead of ikimashita, you can say itta. Instead of tabemashita, tabetta. So you'll start to see these. The shorter form is typically less formal, but in fact, in real life, they are used kind of interchangeably. Now, the future in Japanese is a little different from in English. So tomorrow is ashita. Ashita ikimasu. So the ikimasu word, ashita iku, can work in the future. You do have a form of the future which is sort of maybe type future. Ashita, tomorrow, ashita iku daro. Or likely to go, iku desho. But you can also say ashita ikimasu. That means I am going tomorrow. But iku desho. Likely to go, iku daro, also likely to go. That's the future. Very simple. So that's enough for the basic concept of the verbs. Then we get to nouns. Nouns in Japanese are pretty straightforward. no gender, no plural. Hon can be one, it's a book, it can be one book, many books. There's no masculine book, feminine book, it's hon. Ye is house, kuruma is car. But you tell from the context. So if you say hon taksan, taksan means many, hon taksan, many books. And they do have a thing called counters. So, but I always use hitotsu. Hitotsu means one. Hon hitotsu, one hon. I'm not sure what the counter is for book. Pon, I don't know. Doesn't matter. I don't worry about counters. I do quite well in Japanese. I don't know. Kami ichimai, one sheet of paper, obviously. An animal is ippiki. These are counters, but you don't. Ikko works like there's a generalized counter. I don't worry about it. The key thing about nouns is that there's no gender and there's no number. And you tell from the context how many we're talking about. The next thing about nouns is the sort of bugbear for many people in Japanese is what they call particles. So in some languages, the case ending changes depending on the function of the word. In Japanese, you have this particle. So, watashi ga, they put the ga after watashi is I, watashi ga. It's a sort of a marker that that's the subject of the verb. If I give someone a book, watashi ga, me, I, hon o, the o indicates that it's a direct object. I have picked up a book. Hon wo, anata is you, anata ni. The ni is to you, so hon wo, anata ni, agemasu, give, ageru, agemasu. So, these different particles, as they're called, they attach to usually a noun, and they indicate the direction. So, ie kara, from the house, ie e, to the house, anata ni, to you, anata kara, from you. Actually, not that difficult a concept. An easier way of doing things than the case endings in Slavic languages. So again, you just have to get used to it. Don't try to remember them all at once. You'll slowly get used to it. That the little particle after the noun tells you whether it's an object or indirect object, or it's to something, from something, for the purposes of something, and so forth. Adjectives typically come before the noun. Akai hon, red book. Oki ie, big house. Adverbs are usually or very often formed from adjectives. So akai, akaku. Akaku is an adverb of red, like, for example, when they say it's not red, akaku arimasen, it's not red. Hayai is fast, hayaku is the adverb fast. A fast car, hayai kuruma, and then hashiru, to run, hayaku hashiru. And again, the adverb comes before the verb. Very simple. Purpose in Japanese is provided by whatever comes after the verb. In order to is temune. So, hashiru temune, in order to run, shiru temune, wakaru temune, in order to understand, wakaru temune, and that gives you the purpose. If is naraba, so you can say hayakereba. So this hayakereba is if it's fast. Hayai naraba is also if it's fast. One of the things about Japanese is there's always 2, 3, 4, it seems 2 or 3 or 4 different ways, interchangeable ways of saying things. And you can use them, whichever one you want to use. Don't worry about it too much. Because is naze naraba. Naze naraba. So again, the naraba is, so, One of the words is, Japanese is full of these filler phrases like so desu ka, so desu ka, so de areba, if that's the case, so de areba, if that's the case, so de areba. You get to use these, they're great, they give you time to think. To me, and can't go through all the grammatical forms of Japanese, you get to learn very quickly that the verb comes at the end, and a lot of good things come at the end of nouns, at the end of verbs. Politeness is something that I wouldn't worry about at the beginning. As a foreigner, I would try to speak as neutral as possible. And eventually you'll get a comfort level in being extremely informal or being formal, depending on the situation. But it's not something that you're going to be able to do without a lot of exposure to the language. So I don't think it's something you can learn theoretically. It's something you have to gradually get used to. And that's why, getting back to the original point, do a lot of listening and reading, but in order to read, you have to learn the writing system, the hiragana, the katakana, and the Japanese characters. And with enough exposure and enough listening and reading, you'll get a sense for the language. And at that time, go and pick up a simple Japanese grammar book or even a starter book. And then you will encounter a lot of these explanations. Don't make it too complicated. It's actually not a difficult language from the point of view of grammar. However, the issues of politeness, the issues of the writing system, and the fact that it is structured differently from European languages make it a language that's more difficult to get used to. And that's all the more reason that you have to expose yourself to as much of it as you can. And don't worry about struggling to speak in the early stages. You're going to struggle. Okay, thank you for listening. Bye for now.